take us live and then we'll get going. Here we are. All right, so let me introduce you properly. This is In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer, and I am Frank Schaeffer, and my guest is philosopher and author Matthew Stewart. And Matthew has written many books. He's got a new one actually coming out in a little while. What's the new book? It's going to be out soon. I forget. It's the
Yeah,
Emancipation of the Mind, but when's it come out?
the publication date is March 26th, so 2 weeks.
Good. Well, we'll have you back on to talk about that and let people know
Well, you
about
might want to
it.
wait. Might want to wait and see how this goes.
You know, we are people of great faith here. We're not
Thank you.
going to. Um, so let me cut to the chase here and say that you've written a book that has been out for a while. The 99%, the aristocracy that is entrenching inequality and warping our culture. And I got into your work via an article that came out in The Atlantic a few years ago, and then just read this book again to make plenty of notes to be able to talk intelligently about it with you today. And I think the way I would like to get into this is just to jump into a couple of things that I think set the book up well. So I'm going to read something from your book to you, which is always a little odd, but here we go. The way to get human beings to treat one another as moral equals is to make them moral equals on the ground, just as the way to make them reasonable in their ways of thinking is to make them reasonable in relations they have with one another. Um, if I had to pull a sentence out of the book in answer to somebody's question that might run something to the effect of, why was this book written? It just seemed to me that that sentence is why you wrote the book. You're trying to do that. Am I wrong?
No, you're really quite right, and I want to thank you for that because I do think that some people read this as an effort just to make fun of a particular social class, and there is a bit of that. But the deeper interest that I have is to say something about human history
Yeah.
and say something about reason and how important our thinking is for what happens in society. And I think those sentences you mentioned, that's what those get to.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to use overused phrases here, but I felt this book is immensely important. I'm 71. I have five grandchildren and three grown children, and I've been through a lot of changes in my own life that have made me a kind of a keen observer because I've always seen myself as an outsider, raised by evangelical parents in Europe, moved to the States as an adult, ran away from British boarding school, self-educated after that, and I'm a writer who's had some successes. And I always consider myself a little bit apart from the culture I'm in. As a writer, you have a sentence in the book that I'm not quoting directly, but you said something to the effect that I thought was very entertaining and also true that maybe writing books is a bad way to change anything. In that you kind of you have that line in there, and that stuck in my head, thinking, yeah. So I guess the next question is who did you write this book to, except readers amongst the 9.9%? In other words, it's this sort of loop that the kind of people who are going to read this book are not the sort of people you're trying to liberate and inform, if you want to put it that way, in terms of this structural poverty you go through in the book, rolling all the way back in parts of the book into the history of hunter-gatherers, the egalitarian nature of human existence before the advent of agriculture and what we call civilization. The big point you make saying that, the human capital, owning slaves in the most direct sense, but what we get out of other people was really the beginning of the change from a more egalitarian time to our own. I just felt the whole book unrolled in a really wonderful way. I was completely captivated. I love your writing in addition to the content. But just to cut to the chase for a minute before we get into the book deeper, whose minds might be changed sufficiently to actually inspire um, any kind of change in politics or society or consciousness in that 9.9%. 9%. Have you had feedback from people in that class of people, what you call the white coats and so forth? Is the reaction just been sort of anger or ignoring it, or has anybody come back to you and said, "Hey, this made a lot of sense to me. I've changed the way I'm thinking about things"?
Well, the first thing I would say is that I've received a fair amount of response from people who are not part of the 9.9% economically, but who, perhaps to our surprise, turn out to be just as smart and thoughtful as anybody else. So I
Yeah.
am absolutely not excluding those people. And in fact, I think the system is set up to almost generate a large population like that of people who essentially are, not in the at the top of the pyramid, but who are quite well aware of what's going on. And then in terms of the 9.9% itself, I think that the group has a positive side. Historically, anything that's a kind of meritocracy
Hmm.
is at some level, at least in its best moments, an attempt to make our human governance reasonable.
Hmm.
It's a reflection of at least the intention of making our decisions answerable to clear thinking, to professional standards, to objective, non-corrupt, non-kinship based negotiations. So I think that I have hope for a part of it. I don't think it's all bad. And yeah, I think that there's mixed responses. I mean, some of them hate me.
Yeah, I would
This is what
imagine
happens.
some. Yeah.
But I think on the whole, they're generally more open than you would perhaps guess, and they are kind of committed to these ideals. I mean, they're committed to the idea that we should be working to make the world a better place. So I'm kind of optimistic at that level in terms of
Yeah.
readers. I
Yeah.
think they.
I didn't do a survey of reactions. A couple of weeks ago, I interviewed the editor emeritus, who's now writes for them regularly, of the Wall Street Journal. I would have, if we did this in reverse, I would ask him about your book and say, were you aware of this and what did you think from the journal's point of view? I didn't roll back and see how they reviewed it. I want to go to another quote from the book that I think is a good setup for the rest of this discussion. The triumph of unreason. You talk about the triumph of unreason is the crisis of American politics today. Lies have become more powerful than truth. Facts are whatever the loudest voice says they are. Evidence counts for little. Passion proves everything. The people fight for their servitude as if for salvation. By the way, that's just a brilliant line. I mean, it leapt off the page to me. Amazing writing there. This triumph on reason is, as the philosopher Hannah Arendt observed in 1951, the essential prequel to a collapse of democracy. And I thought, again, in looking for a summation of the why for this book, um, that comes very close in the sense that we're talking about, okay, how come we need this book? Well, it would be to prevent that from happening, as I see it, and start a train of thought that re-examines our commitment to meritocracy, the fast track to higher education, all these things we sort of worship, in what I've called in another context, the Volvo driving, um, upper North Shore of Boston, kind of higher education worshiping people. And I think there's big chunks to this book, but one that I think just stands out that I'd like to delve into now is your analysis of the way the educational elite has made themselves kind of indispensable, as in they are the road to success, if you like, and they've made sure nothing else is, on the one hand. And then you have this brilliant section in your book where you talk about, out of that 40,000 applications to Harvard, whatever it is, 40 get in, and then this number, and who gets to finally work in this high-end job. And of that 40,000 people, you wind up with one person earning that $10 million a year, and then other people close at $1 million a year, and so forth. And so you kind of look at this for two things, and then I'm going to shut up and ask you to really get into it. The kind of fraudulence of the promise and how it pays off into this frightened cubicled workforce, combined with this kind of con job that's happened where you have our elite universities, the 200 or so that mean anything in terms of giving you a credential out of the thousands of possibilities. I think maybe I wouldn't say the harshest, but I think your analysis of this problem of higher education cornering this market on potential, flying under the rubric of the meritocracy, which turns out to be a lie in essence, and then the actual result and the kind of workforce, this kind of self-perpetuating. And then you have this brilliant story you're telling about these people who tried to buy their way in with $250,000 to cheat the system. But you show how what they did is just marginally different from what so many parents are doing with their $10,000 investment with coaches to help their kid get in. How do you make a 16-year-old look socially conscious? Okay, I've done enough talking, but I just think that section of your book, if I had to lift one thing out and say, this is the price of admission, buy it just for this. I buy it for the whole content, but that whole analysis of higher education, I just think is brilliant and has a kind of a philosophical twist to it that doesn't exist anywhere. And I've read a lot about this.
So thanks, Frank. That's a lot of great stuff. I took note of a couple of things that you mentioned. I want to just respond to. The Wall Street Journal did actually review this book, and they reviewed some of my previous books. And what they do is they assign, I think, one of what I'd call one of their sort of pack hunter dogs, who doesn't actually read books, but just kind of looks at the cover, figures out that it's the enemy, and then writes a kind of polemic intended to take it down. I find that kind of validating in a certain way, because it tells me that the 0.1%, as it were, sees this as a threat. So I think that's interesting. The line you quoted about people fighting for their servitude as if for salvation, yeah, that is key. I'm embarrassed to say that I hope I cited it. That comes from Spinoza.
Yeah, and I saw
Baruch.
you were talking about Spinoza earlier, and forgive me if I didn't look at the citation, but anyway, it's a great line. So good for you
No,
to.
yeah, I mean, maybe I didn't. Maybe I just kind of pretended it was me, but I wasn't the genius writer in
I
that.
don't
In
think you
that
did. I wasn't checking footnotes and citation. I was just reading and making my own notes.
case.
So
Um, and then you talked about the triumph of unreason, which I think is the central thread of the book, and I'm grateful to you for bringing that in. I want to just step back for a moment, though, and insist that I'm not suggesting that the present is utterly unique in this respect. I think we've been on a very bad swing in the past 50 years. But most of human history is quite unreasonable. And I'll give you something from the background of my working on this stuff. I actually started writing the slavery book that's coming out now, well before I wrote the 9.9% stuff. And it was really from working on that and seeing the kind of irrationality going on there and the massive increase of inequality during the slave period, not just racial inequality, but economic inequality. All of that was an important background motivator for me. I wanted to say we're experiencing a kind of triumph of unreason that's not unlike the incredible irrationality that took hold during the height of the slave republic in the United States.
yeah,
Also, many earlier periods in history, like the time that Spinoza was writing in the 17th century in Europe. So that's to some of the first stuff you said. And then, of course, you zoom in on the educational stuff. And yeah, I mean, that is kind of the emotional heart of the book for people who are in the 9.9%, because let's face it, I mean, half of our lives, and I say this as a parent, seem to be kind of organized around the idea that we've got to figure out how to get our little kids into a brand name university so that they can succeed in life. And I did want to analyze that. And my real goal, and you're hinting at this, is to explain how that kind of system can end up promoting this irrationality.
yeah,
And I did offer some mathematics in the background for it. And you were referencing the thing about 40,000 applicants to
yeah.
Harvard.
I may have gotten the
getting
numbers
reduced
wrong,
to,
by the way, but
no, I think you got it right. Actually, it was 40,000. So
yeah,
and then it goes down to 1,600 students. 800 of them apply for consulting jobs. 16 of them get the consulting job, and then 10 years later, one of them is a partner at McKinsey and makes $10 million a year. So that's actually not an unreasonable representation of the way wealth gets distributed in the country. And then we have this idea that we lay on top of that, saying that, oh well, of course it's because they're smarter and they work harder, and it's shown by their the degree. That one person there was obviously he was 40,000 times smarter than the people in the rest of the distribution.
Mm.
Um, and then but that's obviously not true. And you can analyze this mathematically, and I encourage people to get into the math a little bit. Intelligence and other talents are generally distributed in a Gaussian distribution or a bell curve, whereas income in a modern economy is distributed according to a Pareto or power law distribution. Those two things don't match up, but we try to rationalize them. We try to make them fit. And
Mm.
when we do that, we take on board all kinds of crazy assumptions. We seriously go around imagining that, Jeff Bezos, uh, who was at Princeton a year after me, by the way,
Mm.
um, that he is just infinitely smarter, or at least 100 billion times smarter than
Right.
you or I are, right? And we also assume at the other end that the people who don't make it are just undeserving, incompetent, and so
Yeah.
on. So that kind of inequality leads to this very deep irrationality. It leads to lots of psychological problems. It leads to narcissism. It leads to lack of self-worth. And those things in turn feed into the political process.
Hmm.
And so my claim is, in the present, we're going through that in a big way, in the same way that the slave republic did, in the same way that ancient Rome did.
Yeah.
And we're seeing that kind of triumph of unreason play
Yeah,
out
one of
now.
the interesting points you bring up in this whole discussion is a physical one. I remember when I was in boarding school in the UK in the early 1960s, that our domestic staff were all a head and a half or more shorter than our headmaster and our members. They were impoverished teachers, but they came from the upper classes and the elite. But the World War I generation who were still there were smaller. And then you get into the physical problems that our folks who fall below the line now of all races have in terms of obesity, physical disability, and then the irony of these schlubby, nerds who wind up running these mega corporations. All of a sudden they re-sculpt their own bodies to look like little, sort of gods on a pedestal. I like that. And let's go there for a minute. Just talk about the fact that, yes, you're a philosopher and there are a lot of ideas in this book, but these are physical realities of a declining population in terms of how long we live, the difference in physical being, the Peloton advertisement that you talk about. I just think that that all leapt off the page as well and was a very good way to illustrate a larger point. And then you tie it in with archaeological finds and, people packing their tombs with their servants who would, go on with them into the afterlife to serve them. And this kind of mentality that's crept into the tech bros. You talk about Elon Musk and others. I just think that whole argument that you make of physical changes, people's bodies, they die 10 years younger. They're fatter, they're shorter, they're not healthy, they're not living. And then the 9.9%, are on a completely different trajectory in terms of longevity and health. And then by the time you get up to the elites, they're presenting themselves as godlike figures who are going to live forever, maybe on Mars, or at least with brain trips and putting their consciousness into computers. Talk about that, because I think, again, that just came right out of the book. Okay, these are ideas, but these are ideas that are already translating into a physical reality that you can see with your eyes. And you have this wonderful thing where you say, if you just walk from this and this area in Washington, or this and this area in New York, the Upper East Side down to wherever, the species that you walk amongst in the lower class, you unashamedly use the word class, neighborhoods. We're getting back into the World War I era of the UK, where the aristocracy are a foot and a half taller and the working class are shorter. They had terrible diets. We're rolling back into that again. And I'd like you to talk about that kind of physical through line that you chart.
Yeah, so it does start just walking around on the streets. It's the experience that I've had and that I know you've had.
Mm.
You just see that there are health differences
Mm.
in different groups. Um, and you see this also, by the way, when you take flights across the U.S., then you wander out of the airport at the in the Midwestern stopping point, for example, and of course, there's always a danger in that of just making generalizations from personal experience. So you have to look at the data, but then the data shows something that is terrifically alarming.
Mm-hmm.
It shows that we have actually had declining life expectancy in key areas, that we've actually had worse outcomes for certain groups of people in our society. And by the way, as Angus, as Case and Deaton have argued, it's mainly in the uh, white, middle-aged, lower education segment, but it's
Yeah.
not just limited to that. So we have this real backward movement. It's physical. It shows up in weight figures. It shows up in diabetes. It shows up in cancer rates. It's a lot of it is opioid driven, but it's not all that. It shows up in the deaths of despair, the suicides, and so on. So it starts with that, and it starts with the statistical observations. But then I'd say there's a kind of higher order reflection that should go with that. And I hope people will follow me into this realm of abstraction. Progress. What is progress? We generally have this intuition that it's something technological and then it moves only in one direction. So our smartphones are getting smarter, our
Mm.
cars are getting faster, they'll be flying someday soon, and so on. So we imagine that things are always moving in one direction. Um, but this is clearly something that's not moving in that one direction. It's actually moving backwards.
Yeah.
And how do we explain that? And my basic proposition is that it's a question of justice and understanding that justice, in a kind of fundamental material sense, is actually the foundation of progress. We
Mm.
don't get humanity in a better state by just inventing a new smartphone. We get humanity in a better state when we have more just, fair, and equal relations with one another. And then we start to build up, make things better. And then,
Mm.
so finally, to address your historical point, because I always feel more comfortable in history. That way I get to read books and look at the facts of the past and so on, and don't have to debate with the haters. But what I find fascinating, that this kind of reversal, this division that we're seeing
Mm.
now, it's happened over and over again throughout history. So
Yeah, exactly.
the some of those first archaeologists and anthropologists who looked at it were just stunned. They would dig up the skeletons from Mycenaean Greece. This is 1200 BCE roughly, and they would find that there's one group that's reasonably tall, not super tall, but looking okay and healthy,
Yeah.
and then there's this other vast group that's looking gnarly and deformed. They represent the bulk of the population, and
Mm.
it's because you have this massive inequality. And then you look at the sources. You read Homer, and you can see that they just think that this is perfectly natural. This is
Sure.
just nature. Of course, nature creates short, gnarly people, and they end up poor, and it creates tall, beautiful people, and they end up rich. But that
Mm.
that completely reverses the causality, completely eliminates our basically our obligation to think about the justice of those relations.
Yeah, and it's interesting because in your book you touch on something that I've read a little bit about, particularly in one of my favorite books that I always am talking about, which is The Old Way by Elizabeth Marshall Thomas, whose father founded Raytheon and took them for interesting reasons. Must have been an interesting guy. Took her at age 19 in 1952, I think, or 1953, to the Kalahari to live among the Sand People, the last sort of unmolested Bushmen that had never had exposure to anything. And her book is so interesting because her mother and she made notes, and they both found an unusual level of egalitarian life in this hunter-gatherer group. And then you kind of allude to that, saying if you go back a little further in terms of skeletal remains and so forth, you find that actually before agriculture and cities and so forth, the original old way did not have this built-in short people are poor and work and are slaves, and then the tall elite. It looked like we had a kind of a better past before we did certain things that became demarcation lines, and where owning people or getting the most out of them became the way of life. I don't know if you just want to talk about that a little bit.
Yeah. So, I think you have to always qualify any of those sort of state of nature discussions with the idea that, hey, we don't really want to go back to the cave, and we're not idealizing or romanticizing,
Sure.
life in prehistory or the paleo time period and so on. But it is, in fact, the case that the earlier archaeological remains justify the claim that there was a greater degree of equality. You don't find these massive differences
Hmm.
in the sort of physical or physiological character of the people, and they seem to have been healthier and all substantially taller. Um,
Mm.
you also have a fair amount of evidence that you have more gender equality. So, not that there's necessarily perfect equality between the sexes, but that there is nothing like the degree of inequality that comes in almost immediately with the agricultural revolution and the creation of large
Mm.
societies. So I think that it's really important to have that as a kind of baseline, because it is a basic test of, what's natural and what's not, of
Mm.
what's reasonable and what's not. And there's especially I bring up the gender stuff because that to me just seems the most obvious case. I mean, for millennia we've had this kind of discussion where there are these massive differences between men and women, and they explain what's going on. They explain why men rule everything and women are
Mm.
subordinate and have all these other attributes. Well, if it wasn't happening in prehistory or not in anything like that degree, well, then you can't really say that it's natural, right? And in
Yeah,
fact,
you can't say, hey, this is just the way we are,
yeah,
because
exactly. And of
yeah.
course, we now know, following a certain degree of liberation and so on, that yeah, women, it turns out, are actually able to work and
Yeah.
compete.
I- well, and in the story that Elizabeth Marshall talks about, or Elizabeth Thomas talks about in her book, The Old Way, of her observations of this group in the Kalahari, um, who, by the way, according to studies that have been corroborated by other people, have had a continuous presence there until it was destroyed by the South Africans and the Germans. Um, for 80,000 years, that's 80,000, not 8,000, speaking of ancient. Um, there was an egalitarian life there between men and women that she had never observed because she's there in the 1950s. This is pre-modern feminism, and she's taking notes saying, what's going on here? The women all have an equal say because they also get food. The old people are respected. The standard answer of a young person who didn't have an answer to a question is, the old people have not told me yet. And he didn't mean the old men, he meant the old people, any old person with experience. So I found that very interesting. Let me just reintroduce you a second. This is In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer. My guest is philosopher and author Matthew Stewart. And Matthew is the author of the 9.9%, the new aristocracy that is entrenching inequality and warping our culture. I think it's an incredible book. And by the way, with your permission, I'd like to include this book in our book club. We have a book club called It Has to Be Read, and I would love it if you would let us fold it into that and bring you back at some time, maybe to talk about that and also promote your new book at the right moment. Um, so I wanted to just roll down one last piece of housekeeping. Please subscribe to In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer at Apple Podcasts and to my Substack. It has to be said at frankschaeffer.substack.com, where I do my commentaries. Okay, that said, I want to jump into another bit of the book here and just read you something. And you're going to have to explain it because I'm not going to. I'll let you do this, but you make allusion to something called the iron law, which you're going to explain in a minute. Perhaps the most useful aspect of the iron law for future anthropologists is that it may help us understand why meritocracy, born of the highest ideals of liberal democracy, so often turns into the handmaiden of autocracy. And I'd love you to unpack, first of all, the iron law, but then I'd like you to talk about that line, because once again, I just think that leaps off the page in terms of what the essence of your book is about.
So I'm trying to remember how I phrased the iron law because I actually wrote it down. And since this book is 3 years old, I can't remember the exact language I used, but I'll get to that. So meritocracy is born of the highest ideals. Well, this is my optimistic side coming out,
Hmm.
and um, my enduring commitment to ideals that I associate with the American founding.
Sure.
Um, and that's the idea, basically, that human beings are capable of governing themselves,
Hmm.
and they can govern themselves according to reason. And one of the first basic postulates of governing yourself according to reason is that you have to respect human equality. You need to
Yeah.
set things up so that people can see one another as equals and act as equals, and then you can form uh, reasonable policy. What happens though is that it's impossible to set up a rule of reason according to a fixed set of laws or rules. That's why when you govern yourself and you govern yourself according to reason, you need to have you set up institutions. You hope they'll last, but the point of those institutions is not to impose an unchanging law, but rather to constantly look at what's happening
Hmm.
and get people to work together collectively to find solutions that work here and now. So you need to be able to revise the rules. What happens in um, as inequality takes hold, as rules get stuck in place and are not revised and end up concentrating wealth beyond what is reasonable, is that you essentially make people unreasonable. Um, you you kind of lead them to believe that they deserve what they get, that the people who earn 1,000 times more than the other people are worth 1,000 times more, and so on. And the consequence of that is that as you move along that path, you become more unreasonable because you've locked in these unchanging, unreasonable rules.
Hmm.
People actually become more committed to the idea of merit.
Yeah.
You, so the more you hear people screeching about how I deserve this and how special I am, the more you can be certain that you've got a pretty unreasonable society, one that
Yeah.
doesn't actually answer to the original ideals of merit. And by the way, it's, we see it in our society, but it's there in the previous societies. Just look at the way the Romans talked about just how great their emperors were, how great their leading senatorial families were. I mean, it's the same dynamic. We've managed to reproduce it in this really subtle way, in this way that we're pretending that we're not doing it, but everybody knows it's there, right?
Sure.
But you can essentially be sure that when you have that kind of the more you talk about merit, the less there is going to be, the less it's actually going to be
Hmm.
doing what it's supposed to do in your society. I was looking for the way I wrote it down. I wish I had it, but I mean, I also say things that human beings are not built to function in an unreasonable world. I mean, that's something I'll stick by, and that's more of a kind of biological argument.
Yeah.
Oh, here's what I said. The more that merit seems to matter, the less it actually explains. Yeah, that was the iron law,
Yeah,
right?
I
So
remember
that's
that.
what I
That's the
think.
iron law. Yeah.
So that gets at it. So it's as I say, it's complex, but I think most people understand that. It's that yeah, we want to keep the idea that you should get rewarded for effort, that you should people with more talent should be given more responsibility, all that sort of stuff. Um, but if you live in a world where you think that everybody's divided into 1,000 different buckets with huge differences, and we should sort of treat one another as radical unequals, well, then in fact, merit is explaining less. It's not explaining what's going on there. What's
Yeah.
explaining what's going on is the fact that your society is stuck with these unreasonable rules and people working to lock themselves in place.
Yeah, one thing I appreciate about the book is that you, from time to time, you kind of take a deep dive into the historical context, which we kind of alluded to a little bit while talking about Elizabeth's Thomas's book. But I'll read something from you. You say, sometime after human beings domesticated plants and animals, they discovered step by step, most likely without much conscious awareness of the destination, how to reap a far more valuable harvest. Corn and cows were good to have, but human beings proved to be the richest crop of all. The invention of conventional non-human agriculture mattered, to be sure, but mainly because it had the effect of crowding humans into small spaces, cutting off the escape routes, and leaving them dependent on an insecure food supply. One rendered vulnerable in this way, once rendered vulnerable in this way, humans could be pushed to the hard edge of subsistence, and compelled to labor on behalf of those who tamed them. And I really loved how you wrote that. And I just am thinking that, our problems that we face today with the 9.1%, 9.9%, as distinct from the 1% you hear about a lot. The real problem is the 9.9. It's the white coats. It's our lawyer, dentist, you know, class of doctor, the professional, and then of course the financial services people, the bankers and the traders and this kind of thing. I like the way you root this back into, again, this great divide between people who were freer and as tall as each other in a more egalitarian hunter-gatherer section, and then the kind of debilitating effect of what we've come to call civilization and the price we paid for it in this kind of rolling story of inequality growing, 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 and then there's a pushback. You reject this circular idea of history. I think you talk about Gibbon maybe or a few other writers, but you don't buy into that, and you say, well, of course they bought into that because through the 1,000 years preceding their moment and maybe the 1,000 before that, domestic GDP growth was pretty static and people did not do better than their fathers and grandfathers, and this is a modern phenomena. If you just want to hook that up a little bit and talk to us about the kind of deep history, how the change came, and then that we're very much in a non-circular moment now. There's a line, and you talk about the difference between the bell-shaped idea of change and statistics, and then this sort of steep ski slope cliff side of meritocracy that leaves everybody else just at the bottom of the slope. I think this is all one kind of idea, starting with that very deep dive into ancient history. I think that's a really important part of your book. I've garbled my question, but I think you get what I'm talking about. If you just want to talk to us about that a little bit.
Yeah, so I would say that there are two, pretty well, they're pretty deep thoughts that you're getting at there, and I want to see if I can draw them out. And I appreciate you going there. So I think one has to do with the extent to which you see conflict at the heart of human society. You can take a very, very dark view, says that it's all conflict, it's all just people, scrapping. You can take a very optimistic view, saying that it's, humans just love one another and we're just trying to figure out how to do it best. I take, I'm basically a dialectical type philosopher. I think they're both there. I think we've lost track, though, of the conflict side, and that's what I wanted to get out in that passage that you read. That's the dark side. That's kind of, if you want to invoke names from the history of philosophy, I would say that's my Rousseau side, because what it says is that the simple optimistic story that human beings just came together so they could build farms and have happiness together is not quite right. Yes, that might have been the very first impulse, but then there's a chain of events where humans figure out how to exploit one another, and that very deep, extractive, brutal conflict. I mean, it's just there. You just spend time reading history. It's a nasty place. A lot of what happens, I mean, it's just so. But the very fact that we see it is shocking, right? The very fact that in Central Europe in the Middle Ages, you'd have human beings, hoarded into pens where they would be the ones who survived would be sold off as slaves, and the rest would be left to die like cattle. I mean, that kind of thing. It's there throughout history, and it gets at this fundamental point that not everything in society works for everybody. I mean, some things are really just basically some people screwing other people. So it's a really simple point in a way, but I think we forget about it when we talk about the modern economy, when we talk about